Thank you very much. I will just plough straight in and see what it's like. Yeah, that's grand. So, as I've said, this year's series of talks is focused on the contribution of women as a tribute to Susan Ross. And I should have celebrated her 100th birthday. And I would also like to dedicate this talk to one of Susan's friends, Alice Mackenzie, MBE, who also died in 2021. She may be known to you as the first Chief Librarian of Strathkelvin District Council. She was also a founder member of Strathkelvin Talking Newspapers and of the Sorpotimists, and she and Susan were both long-term members of the Sorpotimists. And it was Alice who introduced me to Beatrice Clugston, a Victorian philanthropist. She founded both Lenzie and Broomhill Hospitals and the Dorcas Trust and the Association for the Relief of the Infirm. And although the buildings have gone, the two societies continue to support people. I had done some family history exploration, so I was asked to find descendants of Beatrice Clugston. She was a very pious, single Victorian lady, and I didn't really anticipate finding any direct descendants. So I explored a bit wider, nephews, nieces, cousins, so on. This is John Clugston's death certificate, and I realised that it should be a definite nominee for the worst slide ever competition. And I'm going to try and explain why being such a poor slide is what makes it so really good. It's for Beatrice Clugston's father, John, and he died in 1855. And Scotland's got among the best birth, marriage and death records ever produced. And 1855, which is the year statutory registration was introduced, has the very best of the Scottish records. In fact, genealogists call 1855 a golden year because it gives so much information. So, I'm surprised to hear 1856, the information fell quite a lot because the poor old clerks complained of sore hands. So, from her father's record, as again, I say, this is all his children are listed. So we can see from that she had 3 younger siblings who died in childhood. She also had a younger sister who died unmarried in her early 20s. So that was nephews and nieces all done for. So it also gives his parents and also his wife. So I was able to explore a bit further forward John Clugston, Mary Mackenzie, and their siblings and children, who had all been Beatrice's cousins. Didn't do too well, more single ladies, child-free cousins, and emigrants to Liverpool and Australia, and people who frankly just disappeared among the old parish records, and I don't know. So why was this important? Well, many of you will know that Beatrice Clugston is buried in the Old Isle, and that her memorial was vandalised in 2011. And Alice Mackenzie was one of many people who wanted to see the memorial restored. Repair and maintenance of graves and headstone in East Dunbartonshire cemeteries are the responsibility of the layer holder and their heirs, and in the council records, Beatrice Clugston remained the layer holder of her last resting place. The council did accept that Beatrice Clugston had no direct heirs and no relevant family members could be traced. And the Sorpotimists were then told that we could restore the headstone if we became trustees of it. Probably lucky that this wasn't ever a possibility, as the club's constitution forbids it. However, the Antiquaries themselves had set a precedent when you had restored Alexander Bain's headstone, or got the council rather to restore Alexander Bain's headstone. And exploring Beatrice Clugston's family led, obviously, to exploring her work and developing a case that, like Alexander Bain, she was one of Kirky's own, and that it's in the town's interest to restore her memorial. Now, these are both taken in Glasgow Royal Infirmary, and should you ever need to go there, you'll find that it does acknowledge Beatrice Clugston. That's the mural. That's the mural which is in the front entrance to Alexander Parade, and that picture of Dorcas is in the chapel. And it's kind of appropriate that the infirmary should remember her, because it was fundamental to the start of her work. She did come from a philanthropic and religious family, and religious practice threads through all she did. Her father worked with the Galloway Brotherly Society, which is still in existence and still registered with the charity register. And he also worked for the Carlton Bread Society, sort of provide cheaper bread, perhaps do with it now, and with the Carlton Society for Religious Purposes. And her great-uncle William was one of the first Sunday school teachers in the English-speaking world and believed in education for all. So Beatrice was born in Carlton, moved out to Lark Hall in her late teens, and came back to Glasgow when her father died, by which time she was 27. And that was when Beatrice became a prison visitor at Duke Street Prison. And it was visiting a prisoner who had been taken ill and moved to Glasgow Royal Infirmary that she really came across the poverty of patients and their families. And she and a journalist friend were so shocked that they galvanised the wives of the doctors at the infirmary, saying, Mrs. Beatrice saying, I don't know how they could sit back in their fine drawing rooms with all their maids and not feel for the poor souls who were their husbands' patients. And it was from galvanising the wives that the Dorcas Society was founded, starting with providing food, clothes rather, money for the families to visit their families. And eventually this developed into almoners, which developed into medical social workers. And as I said, the Dorcas Society continues to support patients today. This is Lenzie Hospital, as it was. She started off opening convalescent homes in Dunoon, followed by Lenzie, followed by Kirkintilloch. Although the Lenzie Hospital, shown here, actually replaced an earlier provision. Her very first one was in a rented property in Bothwell. Lenzie was opened in 1873, and the site was chosen partly because it was nice and close to Lenzie Station, and patients were made to walk from Lenzie Station up to Lenzie Hospital if they were fit to. Started off as a convalescent home, and then in 1948 it was transferred to the National Health Service. In 1968 it became a children's convalescent unit, and it was later converted for geriatric patients. And despite the efforts of the Lenzie Hospital Action Group, which included members of both the Antiquaries and the Sorpotimists, the hospital closed in 2000, and it's now housing development, and there is no record of Beatrice Clugston there at all. So her next effort was the provision of Broomhill Hospital, and it was founded, and I quote, for the gratuitous relief of deserving persons who have been rendered helpless by disease. They're great Victorians. And her fundraising was record-breaking, and in 1874 she raised £24,000, and with that she was able to buy Broomhill House from a member of the map publishing family, the Bartholomews. And the hospital was the first sod was dug by Lord Shaftesbury, and it was opened by the Provost of Glasgow in 1875. At its largest, it had 100 beds, but it provided a lot more than food, shelter and clean air. They introduced what we know as occupational therapy nowadays, when the patients made goods that were sold in support of hospital funds. There were concerts and slideshow lectures, and right up to the 1980s and 90s, the Sorpotimists made regular visits there and also arranged outings for people. This is also Broomhill Hospital, and part of the way it was funded included people and firms paying a subscription, not unlike the sponsorship schemes that charities used to use for children in developing countries. And also, in those days, firms could sponsor employees who went very well. But fundraising was a feature for both hospitals, Lenzie and Broomhill. until they were absorbed by the National Health Service in 1948. Broomhill closed in 1995 and deteriorated so much it was demolished. It's been built over, and Beatrice Clugston is remembered because the development's called Beatrice Meadows, and it does include Clugston Crescent there. The developers, Carla, have included a play park, and the Sorpotimists are planting a tree in open ground overlooking the site of the Beatrice's foundation, and there's going to be a plaque attached to a stone which has been salvaged from the building. Now, this is a slide, as it says, the unveiling of the monument to Beatrice Clugston, with a lot of splendid Victorians and all there at the opening. Now, as I say, her religion was a constant theme. At her father's bleaching work, she led the prayers for female workers, starting before work every day, and she organised volunteers to visit patients in hospital to read the Bible to them. And all her fundraising events, which were considerable, started with prayers and Bible readings. When she moved to Lenzie, there weren't any churches in Lenzie, so she joined St David's here in Kirkintilloch. And as I said, when she died, she was found on her knees beside her bed saying her night prayers, and so meant a lot to her. So, but she must have been beloved, because when her funeral was held at St David's, the patients from Broomhill walked her coffin up to the funeral site in Hillvale. Now, this is the plaque that used to be on her headstone. She was very well known in her lifetime. She featured twice in a Glasgow magazine called The Bailey. There was a column called Men You Know. I know she didn't qualify, but they did explain that men was sort of, as in mankind. And she contributed at the time much more than buildings. She travelled around Britain. She researched solutions to social problems, and she published her findings and her conclusions. And when she died in 1888, a second public subscription raised money for a public memorial. The first subscription had bought her a house and got her an annuity so that she could have something to live on. So James Pittenrick McGillivray was employed to design. He was quite young at the time, he was only about 32. He was later appointed, after the death of Queen Victoria, the King's Statutory Ordinary for Scotland, and he was also a member of the Glasgow Art Club for over 50 years. Now, the memorial, for those of you who've been up to the old kirk will know, is a large structure. This is what the Kirky Herald said. The masonry of this memorial has been placed in position in the Old Isle Cemetery, which is red sandstone and has a massive appearance. The medallion has not yet been put in position, but when this is done, the memorial will be well worth visiting. The stonework weighed about 10 tons and was brought out from Glasgow in 5 lorries. It took 4 horses to pull each lorry up the steep hill leading to the cemetery. Those of us who walked up the Old Isle will have some sympathy for the horses. It would be really useful if McGillivray's designs had remained available. I don't know whether it's because he was so young that they're not, because they're not in the archives in Edinburgh, Glasgow, or the National Library of Scotland, all of whom have some of his papers. I don't actually know the details of the tender that the council have put out, but in early discussions with Kenwell, it was suggested that design drawings could be made from photographs of the headstone. So we can hope. So, and this is before and after pictures of the headstone, because Beatrice, I don't know why, but she faded sort of, from sort of public consciousness, that the memorial wasn't restored for 10 years after it was vandalised, and this was despite, two of her foundations continuing to support people, both the Dorcas Trust and the Association for the Relief of Infirmity, registered with the Scottish Charity Register, have lasted for more than 150 years. There have been previous calls for Beatrice Clugston's memorial in in the old aisle to be restored, and it is frankly a great step forward that the council have accepted that it is their responsibility. And the Sorpotimists have been very grateful to the individuals and organisations, including the Antiquaries, who've written to the council to argue the case for restoration. Responsibility for cemeteries is within the remit of the Places, Neighbourhood and Corporate Assets Committee, so all the members got an individual email pressing the case for the memorial's headstone, and so did the three councillors whose constituency includes the Old Isle. And we were guided by Councillor Murray and are very grateful for her advice on council procedures. And the decision to restore the headstone at the council's expense was taken at their meeting in November 2021. However, I wrote this sort of, 10 days or so ago at least. Agreeing to doing something and doing it are not the same, so the campaign's not over. And I did sometimes wonder in the middle of a pandemic if it was right to press on, but I'm sure that this is the place to quell doubts, because we need inspiring role models from history. Beatrice tackled poverty and disease with far less resources than we have today. So I took lead from two groups that have shaped Kirkintilloch, the Romans and the Victorians themselves. The Romans said we need bread and circuses, and Beatrice would have recognised the New Testament quotation, man does not live by bread alone. So whether we take inspiration from a restored memorial to a determined citizen, or want to use it as a tourist attraction, we're going to carry on arguing that we need its restoration. And to that end, Sorpotimists are publishing a map and a booklet which will guide walkers around places associated with Miss Clugston. We gave it a first walk on the route last October, and it's hoped that it will be an annual feature for the ramblers, perhaps about the time of her birthday in September. And all the councillors will be sent a copy of the walk route. I have heard, since I wrote that, I got an email to say that they do now have a proposed date in the spring. Not much of a date, but it's presumably before July. So we keep hoping. So thank you all very much.
Good evening, everybody, again. It's great to be back in an actual meeting. We had hoped to start back in the Park Centre in January, but with the Omicron, obviously it wasn't wise, so it's good to be back. Moving on to the talk, I would like to extend the dedication that Jenny gave to Susan for Susan Ross and Alice Mackenzie to my own talk. Susan obviously is a very long-standing and highly regarded member of the Antiquaries. And Alice Mackenzie is my first boss locally in 1975. She gave me a job that included local studies in the title. And it meant that I could actually do local studies kind of professionally even in my own hometown. There's not many people that had the luck of doing professional local studies in their own hometown. So the point is that that's thanks to Alice. Everything I've done to some extent is thanks to Alice, because she gave me a job that enabled me to develop local studies, and especially the collections at the William Patrick Library. So I'd also like to dedicate the talk to my talk to one further person. Alice, I should have said, died on the 21st of December, but a very highly regarded member of the Antiquaries, Paul Bishop, died on 25th of January at the age of only 72. And he was one of my closest associates, both for recent local history work and also work at the Scottish Local History Forum. So that was a very sad loss, so I'd like to extend the dedication to him as well. My talk on Beatrice, to some extent, I'll duplicate a wee bit what Jenny said, but only the salient points, really, the most important points will be repeated again because they're important links on the chain, and I'm used in a different way. I hope Jenny doesn't mind me repeating them in that way. The important points are part of any story, really, about Beatrice, so we'll come in. Anyway, this is Beatrice Clugston. She was, as Jenny said, a very remarkable lady. Her father was a Lanarkshire manufacturer and businessman, and had a lot of really good contacts in the business community in the Glasgow area. And when Beatrice started trying to raise funds for good causes, she made very good use of all her father's contacts. Also, it has been said, the way that she made the contact with these business people sometimes was through their wives and daughters, because she was always gathering groups of women together to do things. So there's actually a very interesting extension to that I'll mention later on, the idea of involving families to quite a low level, if you like. It was something that Beatrice did. But the people that she concentrated on obviously were people that had money, middle class and upper middle class, because she knew that they could do a lot by way of helping the poor if they would put their hands in their pockets and provide some money. So a very remarkable lady, a great personality, was able to make lots and lots of friends and contacts through sheer force of personality, but using her father's business situation that she had inherited to benefit of. So here, once again, is the basic facts. 1827, born in Glasgow, then she went to live in her father's home, a bit later actually at Hall. In 1855, on the death of her father, moved with her mother to live in Glasgow. In 1864, she founded the Dorcas Society to assist poorer patients in Glasgow Royal Infirmary and organised the first of her bazaars. With the proceeds from this, 2 large villas at Boswell were purchased to accommodate discharged infirmary patients. In 1868, she visited homes in England to improve her knowledge of patient care. In 1869, the West of Scotland Convalescent Seaside Homes at Dunoon was opened. It's plural because there were 2 buildings, a large one and a smaller one, so they were always referred to as the Seaside Homes, plural. And the Glasgow Convalescent Home at Lenzie opened to replace the was at Boswell, and then in 1875 Broomhill Home was opened. Broomhill Home was different from the Lenzie and the Noon homes, because the Lenzie and the Noon homes were convalescent homes, really fairly short stay homes. At the Noon it would only be 2 or 3 weeks. Typically, that people would go for a stay in seaside homes. But at Broomhill, it was a home for incurables. So people that were admitted to Broomhill were there for quite a long while and very often died in Broomhill. And Beatrice Clugston herself eventually died in 1888 in Rawson. So this is the current issue of Scottish Local History. It has a picture of Beatrice on the cover. This picture used to hang in Broomhill Home, but it's now in the possession of Eastern Berkshire Museums. Unfortunately, it's pretty badly damaged, especially around the edges. There's a lot of scores and streaks in it. I was able to get the printer of the magazine for printing purposes to tidy up the marks around the edges, so to make it suitable for the cover of a journal or magazine. So that's it, published very recently. The reason it's on the front cover is to draw attention to the first article that appears in this issue, which is an article about Beatrice Clugston, the Queen of all Bazaars. Beatrice Clugston, 1827 to 88, by Douglas Lockhart. Douglas's interest is really in the history of bazaars. It's not so much Beatrice Clugston herself, but the role she had in organising bazaars in aid of a number of good causes, but usually the hospitals and homes that we've been talking about already. So I'm grateful to Douglas for allowing me to use some of his research tonight. I should also say at the same time, there are a couple of other people who have greatly helped with my presentation. One is a member of the Society, Bill Williamson, who had some very interesting documents in his possession that he made available to me. I'll maybe mention his contribution later. But also Janice Miller, the archivist at the William Patrick Library, for access to the archives here. So, this is slightly repetitive, but this really lists the bazaars that Beatrice organised. City Hall, December, all in Glasgow. City Hall, December 1864, for the Convalescent Association for Glasgow Royal Infirmary patients. You can see against each one the amount raised is given. Eventually, the money that was raised through this Convalescent Association bazaar went towards, among other things, went towards the Legacy Hospital. The City Hall, December 1866, is the Convalescent Fever Home and Sick Children's Hospital bazaar. And it was a variety of smaller institutions that were funded by this fund. Then in the City Hall in November 1871, the West of Scotland Convalescent Seaside Homes in Dunoon, there was a bazaar in aid of it. By this date, the home at Dunoon had already been open for a couple of years, so the bazaar was to pay off the debt. So initially, for the Dunoon home, Beatrice did a lot of fundraising with individual people that she knew would have the money to help the fund that she had established for the home. So part of it was paid out of money that Beatrice was able to raise directly from these people, but there was still a debt to be paid off, and the West of Scotland, the Convalescent Home Bazaar of November 1871 was used for that. Then at the Kibble Palace, that's at the Botanic Gardens, in 1875, there was a bazaar in aid of the proposed Broomhill Home in Kirkintilloch. Quite a lot of money was raised here, £13,905. She moved around and there were new halls being opened. St Andrews Halls, I think, was opened in 1877, so it was a much larger hall, and Beatrice was able to make use of that in March 1882 and ran another bazaar in aid of Broomhill Home and also the Seaside Home at Dunoon. In the Broomhill Home's case, the money raised at this bazaar was to fund an extension, and in the case of the Dunoon home, the Seaside Homes, they were still paying off the debt. And then finally there was another bazaar in 1883 in the Fine Art Galleries. I think that's the McClellan Galleries, later known as, in Sauchiehall Street, which was a Broomhill Home supplementary bazaar, because when Broomhill Home opened, they immediately started to think of ways of improving it and extending it, so further bazaars were needed to improve the home. So these various homes and hospitals, Jenny's already showed pictures of. This one is a different view of the convalescent home at Lenzie, opened in 1872. This is the Dunoon homes. There's actually two buildings there. There's a big building behind and a wee building. The big building behind 200 people, and the wee building in front, I think, 25. But it was better appointed, so people that could afford to give that money themselves would be accommodated in the smaller room.
Excuse me, whereabouts in Dunoon was that?
I don't really know, to be quite honest. I didn't look that factor up. I think I did, but I've forgotten. It's no longer there. I do know that it's demolished. I'm not actually sure the exact site of it. And the Broomhill home, you all know this is it as it was at the time. It was converted from being a private house as it was to a home, and then it was immediately after that it was extended. One of the first, Ivan's the one that's the expert on this. One of the first patients at Broomhill home was this man, Alexander Bain, who Ivan quite rightly has pointed out was the real father of television, somebody we should really know a lot about. He has an Emmy Award, which was received on his behalf in America for his work in the development of television. He was really a very significant person. And he was one of the earliest patients to be admitted to Broomhill. Broomhill was opened in 1875 and he was admitted in 1876. But he wasn't there very long because he died in January 1877. But the date's right, Ivan, there has been some confusion over the years. I think that's right, he died in January 1877. And as Jenny said, Beatrice was one of the men you know. I'm not quite sure that I would accept her interpretation that they were talking about mankind. There were thousands of these men that were celebrated in men you know, and only a tiny handful of women. So I think if they claimed that, they were talking a wee bit of nonsense if that was claimed, because if you've worked with the Bailey, as I have, I'll explain in a minute, I know the Bailey pretty well, you come across men and men and men and more men, and only once in a blue moon do you come across a woman. Hardly any women work, and yet every issue focusing on a famous man in Glasgow, usually in the Glasgow business community. We really need to describe Beatrice as one of the men you know, sadly, because it was really all about men. So this is the first picture that was in the Bailey in 1875, this one. And they really gave her quite a favourable. She was working with the business community in Glasgow, and the Bailey was all about the business community in Glasgow. So she was working with them. So it was quite reasonable that they would treat her sympathetically. And they did. It was quite a sympathetic article along with the picture that they gave. But then in 1882 she was featured a second time. So not only was she one of the very few women to feature in the Bailey, she featured in it twice. And in fact, you can see a whole lot of the women that she worked with all round about her here. She was always working with groups of women, and no doubt they're probably Glasgow businessmen's wives and daughters. That's who these people are. And you can safely say that there are far more women in this picture than there ever was in the Bailey individually. By a long chalk. Now, I have done a lot of research into the Bailey. When I was researching the history of Lindsay, the early history of Lindsay, as we know it, is really all about the business, the Glasgow business community that stayed in Lindsay, because Lindsay was built for Glasgow commuters. So consequently, there were a lot of Glasgow commuters, including a lot of quite prominent ones, living in Lindsay, and many of these men had their portrait in the Bailey. So here's a group of Lindsay businessmen that was published in a book that I prepared in 1989 on the story of Lindsay. But before I move on to the next slide, have a good look at John Ferguson there, because I'm going to come back to him in a minute. That's the Story of Lindsay book that was published in 1989. I believe it's still in print at the library. although it was published all these years ago. If anybody really wants a copy, I think there probably is still a copy available in the library. But anyway, after I'd done the Lenzie project and we went into the East of Berkshire years, I carried out a project in Bearsden about all the Bearsden commuters. Some of it's on the internet and the Scran website, incidentally. And in Bearsden there were dozens and dozens and dozens of residents that featured in the daily. I've just chosen one for a special reason to show here. And this is Stuart Cranston, who lived in a house overlooking St Germans Loch in Bearsden, if you know Bearsden. Now, Stuart Cranston ran tea rooms, and he was the brother of the famous Mrs Cranston, who ran the Macintosh tea rooms. And they became very, very famous, and of course far, far more famous than their brother Stuart Cranston here. He eventually became. But Stuart featured in the Bailey, and his sisters didn't. Now here's an unusual heading for you, but I'll explain what is meant by it as we go through. Racial diversity in Lenzie. So we'll go to this picture of Beatrice Clugston. Now, within a couple of weeks in the autumn, two good friends of mine mentioned this picture to me. The first was Ivan, who had looked up the Find a Grave website and had found this picture, and he thought it must be a mistake because it's a black woman and it's in the section on Beatrice Clugston's website. But it wasn't a mistake, it was Beatrice Clugston. And then just shortly afterwards, Douglas Lockhart, the author of the article in the Scottish Local History, sent me an email and he said, could you make sure that the picture of Beatrice Clugston, this one, is placed in a certain position. And the position that he wanted it placed in was Beatrice Clugston's ancestry. So he was really making a hint that there was an Afro-Caribbean aspect to Beatrice Clugston's ancestry. And in fact, that seems to be the case. Beatrice's father was John Clugston, a well-known businessman. And Beatrice's mother was a woman called Mary Mackenzie. But Mary Mackenzie's parents had come from, or had been in Jamaica. Her father was a Scotsman in Jamaica, a tea planter, a sugar planter in Jamaica. And his name was Duncan Mackenzie. But every indication seems to be that Beatrice's grandmother, her mother's mother in Jamaica, was a former slave. She wasn't actually married to Duncan Mackenzie. And it seems almost certain that she was Afro-Caribbean. So Beatrice had some Afro-Caribbean, strong Afro-Caribbean blood in her veins. I don't think there's any doubt about this. And I've come across another story that is only circumstantial evidence, but to my mind is quite strong evidence. This is Josiah Henson, who was an American campaigner against slavery. And Josiah Henson in 1877, before we move on to what happened in 1877, I should have said that Josiah Henson had been born a slave but managed to escape slavery and moved into Canada. And in Canada, he established a settlement for similarly escaped slaves from America coming across the border from the USA into Canada. He established a settlement in Ontario for these escaped slaves. So he was really a very well-known campaigner in both USA and Canada. And consequently, he was invited by sympathetic people to visit Scotland and provide a lecture tour in Scotland in 1877. Reverend Josiah Henson, supposed to be Uncle Tom of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin in Novel. But what should be said right at the start, that for whatever reason, Uncle Tom has come to mean a servile black employee or slave when Josiah Henson was no such thing. He was very much his own man, and he eventually stood up for himself, eventually escaped, went to Canada and supported other former slaves. So he was a very strong character, Josiah Henson, and not the usual idea of an Uncle Tom. But in 1877, he was still known as Uncle Tom because people thought he was the original character in Uncle Tom's Cabin. But anyway, this lecture tour occurred in Scotland in 1877. And one of the sponsors, there are a list of the people here. It tells you here, this is the meeting that's described here. Report of the farewell meeting and presentation in the City Hall, Glasgow, Friday, April 20th, 1877. And these are the people who were really providing support to sponsorship for Josiah Henson when he came to Scotland. And you can see here that one of them is William Miller of Lenzie. Well, William Miller was the very first minister of Lenzie Union Church. Lenzie Union Church was opened in 1875, and William Miller became minister of the church at that time. And we're only here at the time of this meeting in 1877, 2 years later. Lenzie Union Church. But William Miller really was quite an interesting character altogether, and seems to have involved himself in a number of radical causes. And it's no surprise really that he was providing that support for Josiah Henson. But further than that, he seems to have organised a Josiah Henson lecture in Lenzie, because this is the testimonial fund for Reverend Josiah Henson, subscriptions and proceeds of meetings. And many of the meetings were actually meetings that had been set up locally so that Josiah Henson could give a local talk in wherever it was, Helensburgh, Rothesay, Dumbarton, or Weems Bay, and various other places. But look, Lenzie, proceeds of meeting, Union Church, £18. So there was a Josiah Henson meeting in Lenzie in 1877. That's just so you can see it a wee bit better. You all read that there, proceeds of Lenzie, proceeds of meeting, Union Church, £18. Is that all clear? That would have certainly have been a lecture talk by Josiah Henson. And the other point about all this, this tells us where Mr. Henson stayed, at Paisley, at Dumbarton, at Helensburgh, during his tour, at Helensburgh, at Weems Bay, at Rothesay, at Coatbridge, and at Lenzie with the Reverend William Miller of Union Church. So Josiah Henson actually stayed in William Miller's house. Now remember what I said about Beatrice Clugston's racial connection. I'll come back to that in a minute. I think I've got another slide to show first. Oh no, I'm forgetting the order of my slides. No, this is the one that goes with that one. Yes, he stayed with Josiah Henson stayed at Lenzie with the Reverend William Miller. So what we really want to focus on now is William Miller's house, which was in Monteith Avenue in Lenzie, not far from the Union Church. And I've looked up his house in the valuation pool. And you can see it here. Reverend William Miller, as minister of the Union Church Lindsay, this is the entry for his house in Beach Avenue in the Valuation Road. And see who's next door to him. Can you read that? What does it say? Beatrice Clugston. So Beatrice Clugston was living next door to the Reverend William Miller when Josiah Henson came to stay with them. Remember, William Miller was a very radical character, looking after good causes. So I'm not the slightest, in fact I know that he was associated with Beatrice Clugston because thanks to Bill Williamson, we have clear information that Beatrice Clugston was working with William Miller. I'll show you that in a minute. That's just a clearer version, just so that you can all see just the single column there. William Miller next door to Miss Beatrice Clugston. Now this is very interesting. I'm just better keep an eye on my time here. All right, Ivan. This is, I don't know the date of this. I got this again from Bill Williamson in the Society. It says at the top, National Institution for Incurables. And the notice is I put this up for a particular reason, but it's actually very interesting in itself. Because remember what I said about Beatrice Clugston talking to the wives and daughters of the Glasgow business community. She was trying to raise funds. She would get at the men via their wives and daughters. She went further than that. She seems to have been talking to their children as well. On Saturday at noon, a meeting of boys and girls convened by Miss Clugston was held in the Queen's rooms for the purpose of interesting them in the above institution, National Institution for Incurables. That would be in connection. The little ones were accommodated in the area of the hall while their seniors were seated in the galleries. The chair was occupied by Mr. R.T. Middleton, who was supported on the platform by the Reverend Mr. Oldham, the Reverend Donald MacLeod, and the Reverend Mr. Miller of Lindsay. So William Miller was involved with Beatrice Clugston's fundraising. So the two of them knew each other very well and worked together. Incidentally, the children were told to try and provide some funds from their own means as best they could. So these were children, obviously, of well-heeled businessmen, if we could do any such thing. They were actually being asked, as children, to subscribe to Beatrice Clugston's fundraising. And indeed, they were all asked to speak to their friends and see if they would subscribe to the fundraising as well. So Beatrice Clugston worked with wives and daughters, but she also seems to have worked with children as well. And as the notice goes on further down, it's quite clear that a next door neighbour, the Reverend Mr. Miller of Lindsay, was very much involved in all of this as well. And he had, during this period, the Reverend Josiah Henson from America living with him for a short while. This is an old postcard. It shows Beatrice Clugston's house on the right-hand side there. This is looking east along Moncrief Avenue. And this is what the house looks like today. And this is a picture of Josiah Henson and his wife at the meeting that I was talking about at the City Halls in Glasgow a short while ago there. So, but there's always a downside. We're really talking about all these enlightened people that were living in Lindsay at that time, apparently, supporting Josiah Henson, supporting Beatrice Clugston, whether or not they realised she was an Afro-Caribbean woman. But there was an opposite side, unfortunately. This man here, John Ferguson, was actually a very radical liberal in politics. He's very highly regarded for some of his radical ideas. And indeed, he was a Protestant Northern Irishman who promoted home rule for Ireland, which was really quite unusual at that time, and at any time, I suppose. But that's what he was. So he was known locally for causes like protesting about the closure of the Woodley right-of-way and getting the Spider Bridge built. John Ferguson had a lot to do with the Spider Bridge getting built. So he was well known in local, standing up for local issues as well. So he had lots of good causes to his name. But unfortunately, as a publisher, he published a very unfortunate type of literature. It's so unfortunate that we've had to lock out part of what it said. Now, John Ferguson was his name. The publisher was Ferguson and Glasgow. And you just need to take one look to see what kind of thing it is. And John Ferguson, unfortunately, published a lot of that kind of thing at a time when he was living in Victoria Road in Lenzie, the other side of the railway. So, not everybody was taking an enlightened view of black people in Lenzie at the time, it has to be said. And it seems that, surprisingly enough, that John Ferguson attended the Union Church, because certainly when he died, his funeral was conducted by a later minister of the Union Church. So Beatrice Clugston was one of the men you know, but she was also a leader of ladies. I've explained what she was all about already, and the ways in which she was a leader of ladies. Basically, she would get a lot of the leader, a group of her sort of female acquaintances to join with her every time she was organising a big project for a bazaar. Both organising the bazaar and then running the bazaar when it was actually open and running. So here's just a typical example of the ways that she worked with the ladies. And when I was editing Douglas Locker's article for Scottish Local History, one of my colleagues said to me, "Why are we always talking about ladies? Nowadays it's always women as the term we use." But of course, in Beatrice Clugston's day, ladies was the normal, so it's ladies they were. 1864, she was secretary of the Ladies' Dorcas Society in association with Glasgow Royal Infirmary. A convalescent home was proposed and a bazaar organised. 1871, leader of a group of ladies who organised and ran a bazaar to raise funds for development of communal convalescent seaside homes. 1874, a group of talks explaining bazaars at meetings of ladies in Glasgow, Paisley and Greenock. 1875, bazaar in support of a proposed home in Edinburgh. Miss Clugston was in charge of the children and working men's table. Now all these ladies that organised the bazaars in conjunction with Beatrice Clugston, when the bazaar was actually up and running, they would all take charge of one or two tables in the bazaar. And some of these were really some of the richest women in the Glasgow area that Beatrice Clugston would persuade to staff tables at the different bazaars that she was organising. 1875, she organised the planning of a bazaar in Glasgow that led to the creation of her home. In 1880, addressed meetings of committed ladies across the west of Scotland, leading to a bazaar in support of the Noon and Brunel homes. And in 1885, she set up a ladies' auxiliary of the Association for the Relief of Funerals. So I think we can leave it at that point. A very, very remarkable lady, an enormous personality she had, and she knew how to get to know the right people to be able to help her fund her projects and run her bazaars, including the staffing of them.